We're excited to have you join us for the Come Follow Me 2021 podcast and study of the Doctrine and Covenants. Hosted by Rod Meldrum and Jonathan Neville. And presented by Gospel Doctrine Answers. In today's podcast, we will study Doctrine and Covenants 2 and Joseph Smith History 1, 27 through 65. The hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers.
Welcome, everybody, to our podcast, and we're excited about this week's lesson. This again, we're talking about the Come Follow Me manual for the Doctrine and Covenants this year. And you probably recognize this young man here from a previous podcast there. Yeah. But this is we're on lesson 3, and this is Doctrine and Covenants section 2, and Joseph Smith History chapter 1, or basically only one chapter there, but 25 or 27 through 65.
That's right.
So this is we're going to be talking a little bit about Moroni's visit.
Yeah.
To the young boy Joseph Smith, and a little bit more about that. Now, last week we talked a little bit about the first vision and those kinds of things. So excited about talking a little bit more about Moroni's visit and what were some of the things that were being discussed and how that happened. So
yeah, okay, all right, that sounds good. Well, it's interesting that there's the Joseph Smith history in the Pearl of Great Price that describes the visit a little bit. But that was not the first history. That was not the first recorded history of what happened when Moroni visited Joseph Smith. Yeah. And so a lot of members of the church aren't even aware of the first recorded history of it. And so I thought I'd present it a little bit in a PowerPoint slide, but before I do that, I want to show where listeners can read it for themselves. If you have a copy of the Joseph Smith Papers, the book, this is in Histories, Volume 1. And it's Joseph Smith Histories 1832 to 1844. Right in this book, there's a description of Moroni's visit that's very detailed, much more so than the one
that we have in the scriptures.
Yeah.
In the Pearl of Great Price.
In the Pearl of Great Price. The lesson manual talks about the visit of Moroni to Joseph Smith, and it quotes from Joseph Smith History. But a lot of members of the church don't realize that was not the first recorded history of what happened when Moroni visited him. And so we thought, as a supplement to the lesson, to introduce or remind some members of the church about this earlier history that was actually republished in 1834.
And this, the scriptural part comes basically from this earlier history, more or less?
Well, Joseph Smith history was compiled by his scribes from various sources. Right. So it was including some of the earlier history that was done, as well as what Joseph Smith narrated, and probably what other people said too. Yeah. But as an example, the 1834 history, which is in the Joseph Smith Papers, has much more detail about the visit than the one in the Pearl of Great Price. And for those of you who have Joseph Smith Papers, this is what the book looks like. It's the Joseph Smith Histories, Volume 1, Joseph Smith Histories 1832 to 1844. And in this book, you can see I've marked a lot of things in it, but in this book, a bunch of stuff there. If you have this book, you can turn right to page 58 and 59. And I'll pull it up here on the screen so you can see what it reads in just a minute. But first, I just wanted to emphasize that it's right in Joseph Smith History, and it was written by Oliver Cowdery with the assistance of Joseph Smith. So let's look at the slide here. This is the cover of the lesson manual, where it is for January 11th through 17th. And I'm going to show you here some of the depictions of Moroni's visit. That we've all been familiar with these. There's a lot of different interpretations of what it looked like. The most popular one maybe is the one in the middle. And if you go to the Visitor Center in Palmyra, they'll tell you that there's a real strange aspect of that picture. Do you know what it is? The one right in the middle?
I remember. Somebody was telling me about that. What was that?
Yeah, there's a shadow behind Moroni, but Moroni was a source of light.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense. So, yeah, there would not be a shout out behind Moroni, right?
No, but he's the one that's good.
He's like the light bulb right in the middle. And you can see some of the other pictures, he picked it a little more accurately, where he's the source of light. But anyway, that's just this fun side note. So the point is that what did Moroni tell Joseph Smith? He told them things 3 times that night, and then once again in the morning, right?
Yep.
And so if we want to know the earliest recorded history, now Joseph Smith actually wrote a history in 1832 when he briefly mentioned it, but he didn't really say anything. So the first one that was detailed was this one, and it's in this book, as I've just mentioned, or it's online. You can see it online. We have the link here that you can click to this page. But here's what Moroni said. Joseph and Oliver said that he, Moroni, then proceeded and gave a general account of the promises made to the fathers, and also gave a history of the aborigines of this country, which is interesting.
What country are they in?
They were in New York, in Palmyra.
Exactly.
And said that they were literal descendants of Abraham. So the
Aboriginal people that are there in this country, the one that they are in at the time, are literal descendants of Abraham, and this. And here's their history.
Here's what I find really interesting about this. Because when he said the history of the Aborigines of this country, what could he be referring to? The word country. Mm-hmm. And so you have different possible applications if you look in the dictionary. It could be the country in the area where they live.
Outside of the city. Kind of the country.
Out in the country. Because Joseph Smith lived a few miles out of the town. It could be this country, meaning a larger area, maybe like the state or the region. Like that, or it could be the nation of the United States. Yeah. And it wasn't clear here. Now, of course, the United States at that time was much smaller, didn't even reach the Mississippi River. But still, it was the history of the Aborigines of this country. And in a few more lessons, we'll be talking about where the mission to the Lamanites was. Yeah. What were those Aborigines?
Exactly.
And that's going to be interesting, but we'll save that for later, right? But the point is here that in this recorded history, Moroni told them it was a history of the Aborigines of this country. And then he went on to say he represented them as once being an enlightened and intelligent people possessing a correct knowledge of the gospel and the plan of restoration and redemption. The plan of restoration and redemption becomes important later also in the translation of the Book of Mormon. We'll talk about that when we get to that. Mm-hmm. But it's something a lot of people haven't focused on before that I can't wait to tell about, but not today. Okay. So this is what Moroni said. Now, he went on, to say something even more fascinating in the next paragraph.
The next one is
here's what he said. He, Moroni, said, and I remember this is him telling Joseph Smith that night, he said, this history was written and deposited not far from that place. I'm going to read the whole thing, then we'll come back.
So when it says that place,
we're going to come back. We're going to come back to that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. This history was written and deposited not far from that place, and that it was our brother's privilege. Now remember, this is Oliver Cowdery writing, and he always referred to Joseph Smith as our brother.
Yeah.
Our brother's privilege, if obedient to the commandments of the Lord, to obtain and translate the same, meaning the record, the history,
the plates,
by the means of the Urim and Thummim, which were deposited for that purpose with the record. Now look at all the stuff that we're told here.
Yeah, that's so important.
Okay, so we have, they were the Aborigines of this country. That's one point that we want to keep in mind. Excuse my terrible writing. But I want to keep it up there because it was on the other slide.
Yep.
And then he said this history of these Aborigines was written and deposited not far from this place.
So in order to be written, that means that they had to, the Mormon and Moroni basically had to have the plates, the original plates, they had to be inscribing them, which is the written part. And then these were deposited not far from where they're at, the place that they're talking about here.
Yeah, so this from that place is where Joseph was living at the time.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of a dispute among church historians if it took place in the cabin or in the unfinished farmhouse, but it doesn't matter. It was on the Smith farm. Mm-hmm. So Moroni told Joseph Smith this history, the abridged history, was written and deposited not far from the Smith farm. So in other words, it was written in New York. Which is awesome.
No question about it.
Yeah, just awesome right there. And then he went on to say that if Joseph was obedient.
Part of the reason why I think we want to bring this up is because there are those who don't believe that this happened here. So if it did happen someplace else, let's say Central America, for example, then how was it written up here?
Yeah, exactly.
Because they say, well, it was deposited up here, but it wasn't written up here because this wasn't the lands of the Book of Mormon. They were someplace else.
Right.
But this actually gives us a strong indication, at least,
that's what he said.
That these were not only deposited here, but they were also written here, and that's, I think, one of the key factors.
And it was the history of the Aborigines in this country.
Yeah.
So all three.
So it's not talking about
all
the Incas or the Maya or the other people from other places. These are Native Americans or Aboriginal people here in
this
the New York area.
If we were in Palmyra right now, right, we would say in this country.
It makes sense. Yeah,
it makes sense. And you can picture how Mormon and Moroni, but mainly Mormon, had to write the abridgment where all the Nephi records were.
Yeah.
Like you just said. So it was written and deposited not far from Joseph Smith's house. We're going to see in a minute how far away. And then he would have going
to be translated.
His privilege to translate them with the Urim and Thummim.
Right.
That were deposited for that purpose in the record.
Oh.
So I just got to...
Which tells us that basically it was... also what we talked about before, it was translated. It was a translation. It wasn't just a reading.
Right.
And
with the Urim and Thummim.
And he was using an instrument that God had prepared centuries in advance.
Right. Yeah.
And made sure that it actually ended up in the stone box for what purpose?
Well,
so that Joseph Smith could use them to translate with.
That's right. And what's really cool about this, too, is, people say that the idea of the Urim and Thummim came up later, that Phelps invented it in 1833, but actually there's an earlier account in a newspaper, East Coast newspaper, about the Urim and Thummim. But right here, according to this history, this is what Moroni said. He said this history was written and deposited, and that Joseph would have the privilege to translate the same by means of the Urim and Thummim, which were deposited. So it was Moroni's word here that they're talking about. Now you could debate that.
He was telling Joseph Smith about this before Joseph Smith had even seen the plates or even knew that they existed. Exactly. This was the night that this was happening,
that's
apparently, from what he's saying.
Right. And he said, and he had never heard of the Urim and Thummim. I mean, he may have read it in the Bible, but this is the origin of that right here in this history. Even though this was published after Phelps's article. For those of you who are involved with church history, you know the Phelps thing, but Phelps wasn't the first one to even talk about it anyway. So, I mean, the whole thing came from Moroni, basically, is what we're learning in this history. Yeah. And again, just to reemphasize, you can read it for yourself right here in Joseph Smith's history, or online in Joseph Smith's history, or in the books that we've written about this church history. You won't read it in the manual or in the Saints book, and we'll talk about why, but you can read it for yourself and see for yourself. So let's look at how far away it was.
Did you talk about that in the last conference? I think.
I did actually.
So you can actually go to the Book of Mormon Evidence streaming site, and you have a whole presentation.
Oh, there's a whole hour-long plus presentation about that. Yeah. Okay, so here's a map. For some viewers or listeners won't understand the geography because they haven't visited the site, but so I wanted to show this. This is a map that shows the Joseph Smith log home, which is number 1, and the Joseph Smith frame home, which is number 4, was not completed at the time that Moroni visited. Alvin was involved,
trying to get that built. Yeah,
right. And Alvin was, of course, still alive at the time, so it's possible that they were sleeping over in the frame home under construction or in the log home, but it doesn't matter.
They had a big family, and it was a very small cabin.
That's right.
In fact, it's kind of interesting, that factor that while this was going on, there was probably several other of the children up there in that upper room.
Yeah.
When
they slept through the whole thing.
They did.
Or if they didn't sleep through it, they didn't ever talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, so the point is that they had this Joseph Smith farm, you can see here on the map, and the Sacred Grove is number 3.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Moroni said that the Lord appeared to him during his lifetime. And it's kind of cool for me to think that also happened in the Sacred Grove, because that's where they were living. Why wouldn't the Lord come to the same place twice, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that awesome?
That's when Moroni says, Jesus Christ has shown you unto me, and I know you're doing. I mean, that was a vision, and he would have been right in this same region here, where that where that vision happened.
Yep. So it's cool to think about the connections between church history and Book of Mormon history being in the same place.
So maybe this has been always a sacred place.
I would think so. Okay.
When Christ and God came to Joseph Smith in the sacred grove, it wasn't the first time that they were there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we can talk about Kirtland that way.
Yeah.
We'll get to that later. Okay, so here, though, I want to show that there's this road called the Canandaigua Road that goes down from the Joseph Smith farm, and it goes south. And then number 5 is the Hill Cumorah. Right so there. How far away is it? I think the next slide's going to tell us. Well, at least it shows the line.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a 2.5 to 3 miles, depending on if you go straight or cross over other people's farms.
It's a good little walk, but probably take you, normal person, probably take about 15, 20 minutes to walk there.
Yeah, 15, 20 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
And so when Moroni said that this record was written and deposited not far from that place, not far from the Joseph Smith farm, he was right. It's only a couple miles from there.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of cool when you understand the context of what Moroni said and you see the geography. Yeah. So the next slide I think we have that shows the relationship today. If you go visit Palmyra, you can see where the log cabin is. Farmhouse is just a little bit down the road, and then the chapel and the temple.
Yeah, the view here is basically to the northeast. You're looking kind of northeasterly,
right.
And then so further on the left-hand side and down is actually the sacred grove.
Yeah.
And then you can see the farmhouse and the temple, and the Hill Cumorah actually would be off on the far right.
The far right and down. And I have a picture I'm going to show you that in just a second. Yeah. I actually took this picture with my drone years ago when I was there. And because I wanted to see, kind of explain to people, especially people in other countries, when I do presentations in other countries, they've never been here. But you can see this is what it looks like today. Now, I have to tell you, I'm old enough that I remember going here when the road went right in front of the farmhouse. Yeah. My brothers and I went out here. We drove up, pulled up in front of the farmhouse, opened the door, and just walked in the house. It was like no big deal. It was amazing.
They're afraid people are going to get killed, so they actually, the church actually, I guess, ended up helping to kind of pay for it to move the road out, the one that you can now see further off to the right-hand side, so the people wouldn't get killed.
There's even a car parked there.
Sacred sites.
But this is what it looks like today. So Moroni came to Joseph Smith in one of those two places, but on this farm. And then the next one shows where the farmhouse is and Cumorah off in the distance. Yeah. So you can kind of see that it's within walking distance. It wasn't that far away. So for Moroni, too, when he was living here, him and his father, when they were writing the record, they knew this area real well. Because they had scoped it all out for preparing for the final war and all that, so they knew where all the hills were. So it was kind of probably a homecoming for him to come back and visit Joseph Smith, thinking, dude, I used to walk around here, Well,
but as we know, I mean, supposedly, I understand that Moroni is the guardian angel of America.
That's right.
So he probably spent a lot of time here.
That's right. That's why we call it Moroni's America.
Keeping him safe.
Okay, so when we read about Moroni's visit, it's one thing to think of it in terms of, let me go back to those slides, because that we see all the pictures of it. So it's one thing to think of Moroni as this kind of Mayan guy who lived in Central America or in Baja or in Peru or somewhere else. He came up to New York where he'd never been before except dropping off the plates, right?
Yeah.
Or
plus they had to carry them all there.
Well, carry them all, yeah.
But also the whole, wagon loads of plates apparently was what Brigham Young talked about. Yeah. There was wagon loads of plates in the hill, but
the bottom line is if you believe what Moroni said in this account, then it all makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
If you don't,
it doesn't really make any sense the other way, does it?
I don't think so. And it's hard for people to believe, and that's some of the issues that the youth have in the church today, because they're thinking, well, wait a minute, if all this stuff happened in Central America or Chile or Baja California or Eritrea or Malaysia, why would Moroni bring the plates here? Yeah. But if you understand that Moroni lived in this area, and so it was natural for them to just to hide the plates in a fortress, essentially, in the Hill Cumorah. We'll talk about that too. But to hide the plates in a place where they lived and they were familiar, then it made perfect sense for him to come back and explain to Joseph Smith that we wrote this record right in this area. It's the history of the people that lived in this area, and we deposited it in this area. These three things we talked about here.
And the Lord has given a special instrument to be able to make this into English.
To translate it, yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the translation in the next week or the week after that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a brief introduction, a really awesome insight into understanding Moroni's visit to Joseph Smith. He was familiar with the area, he loved the area, he'd seen the Lord in the area just like Joseph had, and so they had a lot in common actually in that way. And we just want to give everybody listening or watching a chance to kind of get an insight into this. Yeah. More importantly, though, don't take our word for it. You read it right in the Joseph Smith papers right here. Read it right in Joseph Smith's own history.
Yeah.
And it's really an awesome new insight to think about.
So, is there a way that people can access the Joseph Smith papers online?
Yeah, there is. In fact, we'll provide a link in the notes on the video. But there's a link you can click right on, and it goes right to this page. The one I showed in the video here, it'll look like this. It has, on the left side, it has the handwritten stuff that was written by Frederick G. Williams and one of the other scribes. Mm-hmm. And then on the right side, it has the transcript.
Nice.
But you can see it right there. And plus, the other interesting thing about this is why we're talking about it. This history was originally published in the Kirtland newspaper called The Messenger and Advocate in 1834. Yeah. And 1835, because he wrote 8 essays, kind of the first gospel topics essays is what I call it. But and the good gospel topics essays. But then that was in 1834 and 1835, and then they left Kirtland, and they ended up in Nauvoo, right? When they ended up in Nauvoo, they published the Times and Seasons, a different newspaper. And Joseph Smith gave these essays to his brother, Don Carlos, who was the publisher. He said, publish these.
Again.
And so in 1841, they published the same history in the Times and Seasons. Meanwhile, also in 1841...
Which, by the way, is like these...
Yeah, here's a copy of the Times and Seasons. So in 1841 also, Joseph Smith talked with a guy named Benjamin Winchester, who was publishing a church newspaper in Philadelphia. And he told him, go ahead and publish all these. And then in England...
That was called
the Gospel Reflector.
Gospel Reflector, yes.
And then also, in England, they had the Millennial Star, which is a really well-known church publication.
It's published in there, too.
Published in there, too.
Yeah.
Parley P. Pratt. Right in the first editions, they published the same history. And in England, it was so popular, Oliver Cowdery's history here, these 8 essays, that they published a special pamphlet just containing these, and they sold thousands of copies. They talked about it, they kept selling. So, and after that...
So this early history of the church by Oliver Cowdery was really one of the premier publications that John Smith had published over and over and over again. And every publication really available to him, he decided to have this published. So,
and even one more that I didn't forgot to bring up, and that was in 1844, they started a Mormon newspaper, they called it, in New York City because they wanted the East Coast media to see the Mormon story. They couldn't care less about the Times and Seasons out in Nauvoo. So they started a newspaper right in New York City, and they called it The Prophet. And it had Joseph Smith's logo on it a little bit, or a picture. And then right in there, they published this history again, so that the whole world could understand the history of the church.
So how many times total then?
Well, that's 5 times, plus it was in his journal. And they also published it when they came to Utah.
When you say it was in his journal, somebody had to actually write that in there.
They copied
Joseph Smith didn't do it himself.
That's
they actually
right.
had somebody copy it in there.
For Frederick G. Williams,
But that kind of tells you, doesn't it, though, that Joseph Smith was heavily invested in that. This history.
Well, he helped write it.
Deeply involved at first, and then also made sure that it got out to as many people as he could.
And even when they came to Utah, they republished it again in the Improvement era. Yeah. So it was really the church history for decades. And then eventually this history that was in Joseph Smith history now today in the scriptures was published in the Times and Seasons also, the year after Oliver Cowdery's history was published. Yeah. And it was canonized because, that's a long story we don't need to get into, but it became part of the Pearl of Great Price later. Yeah. But even after that, they still republished Oliver Cowdery's history in the Improvement era. And so there's a lot more to Oliver Cowdery's history that we'll talk about, but this was a key because he talked about Moroni's visit. The other thing, if you read these essays, he talked at length about the scriptures that Moroni quoted. You know, we talked about how Joseph Smith said he quoted Malachi and Isaiah and a few things, But he said, I can't get into all the scriptures that he quoted. But in this history, those scriptures are all spelled out. Yeah, it's all in there. So it's awesome. Anyone who wants to understand church history needs to read these 8 histories, these 8 essays. They're not that long. They're all right here in Joseph Smith's history. You can read them. And, I wrote a book about it. If you're interested in it, I guess we can talk about it. But
Absolutely. Tell us about that.
I just called it Letter 7 because what I found was that even though it's in the Joseph Smith papers, a lot of people don't spend $50 or more to buy this book, and people are a little intimidated by the webpage. So I did a little kind of a pocket-sized book that I don't just repeat the history, but I provide some historical context to it. All the places they were published, the notes that the Joseph Smith papers don't have, I put in this. Yeah. So, that's available if anyone's interested in it.
This has tremendous information about the Hill Cumorah and
all
how many Hill Cumorahs are there, and
all that kind of stuff. But anyway, that's a little insight we give you to the lesson, and we encourage you to read what more of the detail about what Moroni actually told Joseph Smith that night. Because one last point about it, I guess. Yeah. This whole history here of what Moroni told Joseph Smith guided the church for decades after that. People relied on this because this was the earliest published account of what Moroni said, and it's the most complete account. Yeah. The one in Joseph Smith history is abbreviated. It's like an abridgment of what happened wrote originally. Yeah. So
this is good to go back to the original source documentation. I think is always a critical thing. You learn more from doing that. When things are abridged, obviously there's things that are left out, and less information means less complete knowledge about what's going on there.
That's right.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for that.
You reminded me of one last thing. Yeah. Because later on in the year we're going to talk about the Wentworth letter, but it's very interesting because Joseph Smith when he wrote the Wentworth letter, he wasn't quoting from the language from the Joseph Smith history. He was quoting from the language from this account.
So he quoted from this again.
And we'll show you that when we get to that.
And those of you who don't know about the Wentworth letter, basically, it was actually so important was that letter that actually parts of what were canonized.
Yeah, that's right. So where the
Articles of Faith came from that and so forth. And there was also some really good stuff. We're going to talk to you a little bit more about how some critical parts of that actually were kind of deleted at one point. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. Yeah.
All right, so that's a good introduction. Anyway.
Thanks, everybody, and so we want to encourage you to hit like up whatever,
like our video,
the videos here. We're going to have Jonathan is actually going to be doing a lot of these podcasts along with us because he is, like I said, he's just a wealth of knowledge. We have other amazing historians that are going to be joining us as well in these podcasts and things, but how many years have you spent studying church history, would you figure? You're talking about
probably 200 years.
At least feels like.
No, actually, it's a really interesting. I might as well mention that because even from the time I was in high school, I was interested in church history. Yeah. I bought a set. This is pre-internet days. Yeah. I bought a set of the Times and Seasons even.
Really? Just like this right here.
Yeah, like those. I bought the Journal of Discourses.
I was lucky to actually find these actually about 8 or 9 years ago. These.
You can get them on eBay sometimes, but they're expensive now. Yep, so I was always interested in church history, and I read the history of the church and whatever they had available, which wasn't that much. Yeah. And I wasn't satisfied with the kind of the condensed version of church history, so I got the original stuff as much as I could. Yeah. And so I've always been interested in it. I've read what the scholars have said, the church historians, and so on. But I felt like it was important to learn it for myself because after I went to law school and learned that everybody has spin, everybody has bias, everybody engages in bias confirmation, I realized that I couldn't trust anybody else. So after I met you and we started talking about Book of Mormon stuff, I asked Rod one day, why does anybody even look in Central America? And he said it was because of these articles in the Times and Seasons. Yeah. And I said, well, who wrote those? And he said, well, no one knows. They assume Joseph Smith. And that's what led me into this all church history stuff.
Kind of dragged you into this whole fray.
Yeah, you did. You did. I had a peaceful life. But now I've got these guys. I got these guys from like Book of Mormon Central. And just so you know, I call them the Citation Cartel because it's a group of scholars who have groupthink, and they all think alike, and they cite one another to make it look like there's all this research, but it's really just a handful of them.
Yeah.
And so, and I think they're awesome people. We'll talk about that maybe in the next week.
Good folks.
Great guys, but they have this mentality that is all about confirming their bias. And so, and you'll see why. That's why, frankly, that's the reason you don't know this history we just told you about Moroni's visit, because they don't like it because they believe in the Central American.
Because you're not going to see this coming out of them.
Yeah, you won't see it out.
This is stuff that you're not going to see because basically whenever things don't match up for them, they just censor it. It's kind of like we have that a lot of times in the media today and so forth. We'll just get censored if we don't like what you think.
That's right.
But see, for me, it was a little bit different situation as far as church history because actually this set right here is actually one that belonged to my parents.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So I remember getting up at about 5:30, 6 o'clock every morning before school, and we would go through and we'd pull these down, and there's illustrated histories and so forth, and we'd go through these, and they have these beautiful
I remember
things
those.
here. And they're even and they're obviously condensed, and somebody had to compile these things. But I was always utterly fascinated with the church history, and to this day, as I go through some of these books, I haven't opened up in years, and I could still recognize the images. I mean, they're so ingrained. As each one of us kids would be talking about here's the account of Joseph Smith's leg.
Oh, right.
And the doctor that came and did the operation, and how he. All that stuff. We know all about that, but that's kind of where I came from. I didn't really get into the more detailed histories and the original material until much later on in my life. So, but anyway, so church history is absolutely fascinating. Lots to share. I have the opportunity many times to take people back and actually take them to these sites and so forth. So we're going to share as much insights and information as we can, and that we're going to try to keep these shorter, folks. Last year we were running 1 to 2 hours typically for each week, and we've got to try to keep these shorter. So we're going to try to get through it more quickly. And
we'll add lots of references in the notes and at the end of the video, so if you want to know more about it, it's all there. And feel free to contact us. We'd love to know what kind of questions people have. We can answer questions.
That's one of the things we want to add this year to the Come Follow Me stuff that we're doing here is basically if you have questions that you have a burning question about and you want to ask us, send an email. My email address is rodneymeldrum@hotmail.com. Now, it may be a while because a lot of times I don't get to my emails.
The best is to send it to, probably Come Follow Me 2021@gmail.
Yeah.
So that's easy to remember. Send it to there. You'll get the most prompt response.
There we go.
Trust me, if you send it to Rod, you'll never hear
Probably not.
Answer. So send it to comefollowme2021@gmail.com, and you'll get an answer with. Well, you may not get an answer, but we'll address the answer in the podcast.
We'll try
to the extent we can.
Unless we have, there could be hundreds of questions. So,
but we'll do our best.
Only do a couple. So, all right. So thank you so much, everybody. So next week we're going to be in lesson number 4. This is Doctrine and Covenants chapters or sections 3, 4, and 5.
Right.
I love I love them all, but section 3 has an understanding of why these plates were preserved.
Yep.
So if you'd like to know a little bit more why these plates right here were preserved, then join us next week.
There you go.
Thank you so much.
See you then.
See you then.
To me, this is not just another nation. It is not just one of the family of nations. This is a nation with a great mission to perform for the benefit of liberty-loving people everywhere. It is my firm conviction that the Constitution of this land was established by men whom the God of heaven raised up unto that very purpose. This is part of my religious faith.
Get the very latest edition of the Annotated Book of Mormon available now in the bookstore at bookofmormonevidence.org.